Hi everyone. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the experiences of neurodivergent people in the early medieval past. And I want to start by giving a couple warnings. The first is going to be just some trigger warnings. I will be talking about heavier topics in this discussion. So specifically, I'll be talking about themes of sexual violence and of discrimination and the mistreatment of individuals who are neurodivergent. And then sort of my other warning that I'll expand upon a little bit later is we're also going to sort of necessarily be using terms that we now might consider outdated or offensive, as well as just other viewpoints in that same vein while we're discussing neurodivergent people and their experiences in the past. So what made me think that I wanted to sort of talk about this topic is that as I've sort of been existing in some neurodivergent spaces online, I've seen a lot of posts like these, which are very much sort of presenting a rosy, romanticized picture of what the lived experiences of a lot of neurodivergent people in the medieval past were like. So, for instance, this one that I'll start off with is a few people sort of creating in their minds this image of a neurodivergent nun in the Middle Ages and sort of how a lot of neurodivergent traits, specifically traits associated with the autism spectrum, that we might consider sort of damaging or harmful towards people's lived experiences today, might be either non-existent or instead viewed positively in this setting of a medieval nunnery. Some traits, like being able to be more okay with periods of isolation, being more okay with periods of silence, and being better able to adapt to repetition and strict scheduling and regiments like that, could then be seen as positive in an environment like a medieval nunnery or a medieval monastery. And I don't want to say that's necessarily untrue, but I do think we're missing a big part of that. And that's going to bring me over to this next post here, where it starts off with a post where somebody, comments on the fact that life for autistic people in the Middle Ages would probably have been incredibly difficult because they don't have access to a lot of the resources and accommodations that we have today. And sort of the comment threads going under that are sort of arguing against it, more in line with the first post, that again, you're not having a lot of these factors that contribute to sensory overload or to burnout that we might expect a neurodivergent person living today would have. And again, coming up with this very romanticized picture of someone who is accepted because their traits allow them to do things like, again, perform repetitive and isolating tasks relatively well. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to say I agree with the original post in that second thread that no, life for autistic or otherwise neurodivergent people in the medieval past would have been incredibly difficult because they don't have access to a lot of things. The other thing I had sort of noticed in both of those posts, and again, just sort of a wider trend of posts like these going around, is these very much seem to be focused on neurodivergent people that we might consider to have low support needs. And I'm going to start the discussion by sort of following that through, talking about what we might expect as the lived experience of people with low support needs. But I do think it's very important that we also expand our scope and start talking about people with high support needs. And so later on in this discussion, I'll talk about them. So while we talk about these people with low support needs, I think it's really important that we sort of take a moment to focus on this idea of sort of social acceptance and social inclusion, because it seems like a lot of these posts are very much sort of immediately taking for granted, without even mentioning this concept that they are going to be fairly well accepted in these societies. So again, if we think about just about a hypothetical nun, they sort of assume that being immediately able to adjust to these is going to be seen as a positive, and not as, it's weird that you're not having this period of transition. And this is something I think is even more prevalent in the comments on that second post, where, their immediate thought is, oh, he's, really good at tending livestock and stuff, and like he doesn't really, he'll freak out if he eats blueberries, but they're not making a big deal out of that. And that's something that I really immediately think we have to question is, whether or not this would actually fit with the lived experiences of a lot of people. So when you talk about sort of the lived experiences of late diagnosed or sometimes even, diagnosed people on the autism spectrum today, it's much more often that you sort of get a reaction of, well, you're not supposed to be like that, rather than you are just like that. So again, if you talk to late diagnosed people, when they talk about their time pre-diagnosis, yes, sometimes you have people that, their families, their caretakers, etc., will sort of recognize as when they're a child, oh, they just don't like certain foods, and just sort of accept that and move on. But I think there is still, a lot of stigma about things like being a picky eater or not being able to sort of wear certain fabrics because of the texture, or being more touch averse, or whatever these symptoms might be. And again, really stigmatizing them and trying to sort of train them out of the neurodivergent person in a way that we recognize doesn't really work and is ultimately harmful. And I think we do sort of have to immediately question that assumption of, are we really going to expect medieval people to be more accepting? I mean, if we look again at today, we can already see that people are more accepting, definitely, of diagnosed people, and even to an extent of non-diagnosed people in these sort of symptoms today than they are, even a generation or two ago. So I think we really have to question, in the Middle Ages, why are we expecting them to be more accepting of these sort of quirks and these symptoms than they are even today? And I think, the sort of answer is, again, this is because it's sort of an escapist fantasy that we're participating in, and that really there is no reason that we should expect medieval people to be more accepting. And instead we sort of have to kind of accept, if we're talking about this seriously rather than just as that escapist fantasy, that they are going to be less accepting. And that entire discussion is from a social acceptance point of view. And I think we also have to accept a sort of material reality point of view towards a lot of these issues, which is, even if somebody's theoretically very accepting, is there actually anything you can do? So again, to use that example of blueberries, he freaks out if he eats blueberries. That's something I think is very telling, because we also have memes like these existing in neurodivergent spaces today that are sort of acting as an infographic about why people dislike blueberries, and some other sort of more natural foods, because they're sort of less consistent and they're more likely to sort of trigger again sort of sensory issues than you might have in sort of processed foods that are going to be a lot more consistent. But of course, in an early medieval setting, you don't really have processed foods. All of your foods are going to be these highly variable foods. And of course, the other issue you're going to have is again, just sort of seasonal availability. Today in the modern world, we can take apples, if apples are a safer food for you than blueberries, and, eat them year round and just not have to interact with blueberries or with other foods that you might find sort of more triggering. But of course, in a pre-modern world, where, certain foods might only be available for certain seasons, or might just be, a lot more expensive and harder to acquire generally, we have to sort of ask, well, is this something that, even in a situation where people are accepting and trying to accommodate just the material reality of the situation, are you going to have access to that? And that's also something we should expand sort of beyond food. Food is what we've sort of mentioned here, because that was mentioned in the comments. But if we think of something like fabrics, like scratchy fabrics, like scratchy wools, is again something that's relatively common to be described as something that neurodivergent people find triggering, or just sort of more sensorially demanding than certain other fabrics. And then again, we have to ask, if we're living in a medieval world where, depending on where you live, the most common fabric is going to be wool, or if not wool, then probably something like a relatively coarse linen that, again, just is naturally scratchier than, like a cotton today. And cotton itself, at least in terms of medieval Europe, would have been a pretty expensive, very hard to acquire foreign luxury import that, just most people just don't have access to. So again, you have to say, all right, even if theoretically you're living in a society where they are more accepting of the fact that that you react negatively towards wearing certain fabrics, even if they're not going to sort of be exclusionary or sort of treat you negatively because of that, well, is there actually another solution? Are there more fabrics? Are there better foods that you're going to have access to? And again, if you are neurodivergent, or if you happen to be, a close friend or family member of someone who is neurodivergent, just actually think on that. Take their safe food, their safe fabric, their whatever their safe thing is, and just ask yourself, is this something that a pre-modern person, or again specifically for our focus, a medieval person, would have actually been able to consistently and reliably have access to? And I think that realistically probably not, and that's something I think we really need to focus on. And again, these are issues that are when we're talking about the major issues of low support needs individuals. And if we look at sort of higher support needs individuals, things get even more dramatic. And this is where I'm also going to have to go into a bit of a language warning, because I will sort of necessarily be talking about things like neurodivergence, intellectual disabilities, and mental illnesses all under the same brush. This is largely because medieval peoples and most pre-modern peoples in general didn't distinguish between these categories. They're all sort of lumped together. So for instance, in A Guide to Early Irish Law, which is still the definitive text about early medieval Irish laws, about the Brehon laws, translates this all as the concept people of unsound mind. And while part of this is because the text itself is a bit dated, it's from the 70s or 80s, I believe. So again, it still uses a lot of language that we today would consider harmful, but at the time were considered more appropriate medical terms. So it could be a bit of that, but it also is, again, the medieval texts themselves are being even more discriminatory than this already outdated author would be. So while I do recognize that this is sort of a not the best framework to be viewing neurodivergence, I think, one, we don't really have that much option, because the sources we're using aren't giving us enough information to be able to distinguish between a high support needs or moderate support needs neurodivergent compared to someone who is intellectually disabled, or again, more support needs mentally ill. Part of it is necessity, but I think part of that is also, this is something that's worth acknowledging, because today when we talk to people that were treated for things like neurodivergence before we had a strong neurodivergence acceptance movement, and they were sort of lumped into sanitariums, and their issue wasn't really looked on as an individual basis, but just people that are mentally unsound, people of unsound mind. We recognize this as being just of its own nature pretty harmful towards the people it's affecting. And so I think it's important to recognize that that is the default. There is no other option in these pre-modern societies. That's just how people were treated. And that treatment is something we recognize as inherently harmful. So when we look at these these individuals that need more supports, we need to recognize that immediately right off the back, the way that they're being viewed in their societies is in a way that's very negative, very derogatory, and is going to in many ways sort of prevent them from getting those supports and accommodations. So again, if we look at something like the Brehon laws, those medieval Irish law codes, they create a sort of a 3 labels of people with unsound mind. And again, this is something that exists in law codes, and generally in law codes specifically dealing with these people of unsound mind. And when we read texts that aren't specifically accounting for these individuals, it's very often that, again, they are just all lumped together. But even in this case where we do have some distinguishing factors, rather than just a lump sum of people with unsound mind, it's again being distinguished in a way that we wouldn't view as necessarily helpful today. So in the Irish texts, the 3 categories that we generally get are people who are mentally unsound but relatively self-sufficient and relatively peaceable. People who are mentally unsound but relatively self-sufficient, however prone to things like violence or making environments unsafe. And then the third category is people that we might consider non-self-sufficient and are much more dependent on having outside care. And also, I think something that's sort of important to note in that third category, which is called roughly Druth, or Druitt. My Old Irish is pretty terrible, so don't trust my pronunciations. But I think it's worth noting that the term that's used to describe those non-self-sufficient individuals is very ambiguous, in that in a lot of texts there is no difference in that term being used to describe someone who actually is like that, who is non-self-sufficient, and somebody who is pretending to be for entertainment. So for instance, if you have, what we might call in modern terms like a clown or a court jester that as part of their act is pretending to be again, a non-self-sufficient, heavy support needs individual. The language they are used, the terms that are being used to describe them, does not distinguish between someone pretending to be like that for the entertainment of neurotypical people and the individuals that actually do have those conditions, which again is something that today we would recognize as incredibly harmful in and of itself, and that just is the world that they were living in. Sort of continuing with this as we talk about the legal texts, when we're focusing on sort of legal texts and their effect on these individuals, there's a lot of ways that they suffer. Where they're the focus of these laws, but the way that these laws work are necessarily harmful to higher support needs neurodivergent or disabled or mentally ill individuals. And the biggest one, of course, is going to be a focus on sort of verbal oral communication. Because again, part of this is material reality. We're living in a society where literacy is pretty uncommon, and even definitely uncommon amongst the lower classes. There's more evidence that some of the upper classes were more literate than have been previously imagined, but still it seems like the lower classes were largely illiterate. And even amongst people that had literacy, this is before, modern paper technology and things like that. The main method of writing things down appears to be proper parchment made from animal skins, which is, again, very expensive. And there are some lower expense options that are used for, when people are being taught to write before they get access to these higher expensive things. But again, it seems to be very rare. So even if we are dealing with literate people, then there's also this question of, do they actually have, even if one individual is literate, are the people around them going to be able to have enough literacy to read what they would be writing? And also just, do they have material access to things to write with and write on? And the answer is, in most cases, no, or at least not enough to really accommodate for people that are not verbal. So things like contracts are almost exclusively oral contracts, where you have to get in public in front of witnesses and state your what your contract is and things like that, which for people who are unable to speak, whether that's because of being totally nonverbal or just are prone to instances of verbal shutdown in high stress environments like public speaking, then that's going to necessarily inhibit your ability to form contracts and to participate in a lot of these spaces, which again means you sort of are necessarily losing certain legal rights and privileges if you are, again, someone who is either completely nonverbal or prone to verbal shutdowns. And this even goes towards being like the victims of crimes in some cases. So again, this is going to be a heavier topic, so a bit of a trigger warning. I will now be getting on to the topic of sexual violence, because again, in the Brehon laws, it's something that's quite common in a lot of texts, that if you are the victim of sexual violence and you're in a settlement, if you're in a settled area where there are other people around, you have an obligation to call for help. And if you don't call for help, then you are potentially losing that ability to seek justice. if with the assumption being if you didn't call for help, then it wasn't actually non-consensual, it wasn't actually, an instance of sexual violence, but instead was consensual sexual activity, and therefore you lose the right to compensation for the crime, to seek justice against the perpetrator of that crime, and you lose the ability to be seen as the victim of a crime because you didn't call for help. And obviously, this has a lot of really important concepts for how medieval people conceptualized consent, and how that's very different in a lot of negative ways than the way we view consent today. And unfortunately, I won't be unpacking all of this, but instead we'll be focusing on sort of the lived experience of neurodivergent people, which again is to say that this takes people who are nonverbal or prone to verbal shutdowns, which again is a pretty common symptom to things like autism and other neurodivergences, and it makes them much easier to target with sexual violence and a lot harder for them to seek justice and sort of compensation after being victimized. And again, this is not a law that is being framed to harm any of those categories of mentally unsound people, but necessarily is harming people that we would today recognize as dealing with certain neurodivergences or certain intellectual disabilities or mental illnesses. And again, that is something that is not being done intentionally. And there's lots of laws that we might see as being more intentionally harmful. So particularly against that third class of mentally unsound individuals, the people that are non-self-sufficient, there's a lot of laws that sort of give the responsibility of a lot of what we might consider sort of important life aspects away from them and towards other people. So for instance, the non-self-sufficient individuals have other people that are supposed to take care of their land, take care of the profits for their land, and if they are a parent, the full responsibility for the raising and rearing of their children is put on their mentally sound partner. And while to a certain extent we could sort of say that this is, the way they are being cared for, other people are taking on the responsibilities of these things, I think it's very important to recognize that it's not necessarily the case. So for instance, in addition to doing some of my medieval readings on this topic, I've also been reading a bit on sort of the history of modern neurodivergent and specifically autistic advocacy and specifically self-advocacy. And something that they mentioned that they had trouble getting autistic self-advocacy started just in, the 1990s, well within the lifetime of a lot of people today, is that a lot of the neurotypical run advocacy groups would sort of frame themselves as, we'll take on the responsibility for organizing and advocating for you, so you don't have to take on that responsibility and deal with those pressures. Again, framing it very positively as, we are taking on the responsibility, but in effect, it was really a way to sort of not give autistic people the right to sit at the table and the right to their own self-advocacy by framing it as something that other people need to do for you and that you can't do for yourself. And that's something that we should sort of also very much see as existing in these medieval laws. So sure, the law says, that other people are taking on the responsibility for managing the land for these high support needs individuals. But really, we should also read that as those individuals are not able to manage their land and their property and the profits thereof themselves. Likewise, when we read that these people don't have the responsibility for the raising and rearing of their children, we should also necessarily understand that that means they are losing right to any custody of their children. That, rights and responsibilities in these societies are necessarily intertwined. So even though it's being framed as they're not having to take on these responsibilities, that also necessarily means they're losing the rights to these things. Another interesting bit of the law that I think is again, really interesting is the fact that there are laws set in place that protect what we would now consider disabled people from mockery. And again, in a society like this that is very reputation and honor driven, of course, being mocked is incredibly negative. And in fact, there's heavy fines for mocking or satirizing people who are seen as undeserving of that treatment. So it's important that there are limits and safeguards against people being mocked for their disabilities. But it's really interesting that, in a negative way, I should say, interesting in a negative way, that these aren't included what we would now consider, again, things like neurodivergence or intellectual disabilities or mental illness. So, the categories of people that are protected from being mocked and satirized for their disabilities are things like people who are lame, people who are blind, people who are deaf, people who are epileptic. And again, those categories of people who are described as being of unsound mind that we might now recognize as intellectually disabled or neurodivergent or mentally ill rather than physically disabled don't make it onto those lists. And something that I will come back to later once we move off of the legal texts is that, this is something that they would have likely received fairly often. And then sort of the final topic is I want to focus a little bit on laws regarding what we might consider now the neurotypical caretakers of these individuals that are described as being of unsound mind. So in early Irish society, there's a lot of focus on laws about when people have to be in certain situations. So for instance, if you are trying to bring a legal case against somebody, when do you need to announce it to them, and how much time do they have to respond, and what are their obligations when they sort of appear in court, and similar things to sort of non-legal actions where people are required. So if you are required to attend a hosting, to go on and battle and serve your lord, when are you obligated to do that? When are you allowed to get out of it? And sort of those other obligations where you're required to be present for some reason is something that's mentioned a lot in these texts. Something that's mentioned as one of the reasons that you might be able to delay an obligation to appear is described as the tying up of the mentally unsound. And specifically, I think the mentally unsound but prone to violence or the non-self-sufficient are ones that are mentioned a lot, is again, tying them up is a reason that somebody is allowed to not have to be present at these otherwise situations where they're obligated to make an appearance somewhere. And these legal texts do just leave it out to as tying them up and doesn't really give us much detail. So at this point, I'm going to switch around from these Irish legal texts and instead towards one of the Icelandic sagas, which is a medieval saga describing events happening in the Viking Age. And while, of course, there is a bit of a cultural jump moving from sort of Ireland to Iceland, a lot of these concepts that I mentioned are going to come back, or at least a few of them. And it is kind of worth noting that Iceland is being influenced by Ireland in a lot of ways. Of course, we know through like modern genetic studies that there's a very high percentage of Irish genetic influence into the population of Iceland, as well as some other medieval cultural things. So for instance, in medieval Iceland, they seem to be playing a game that is very much descended from the same medieval ancestor to games like modern hurling in Ireland. So this is from a text called The Saga of Gisli the Outlaw, which again is following an individual in Viking Age Iceland, and he travels around a little bit. And in it, there is somebody who is described, again, in a way that we would now probably recognize as intellectually disabled or neurodivergent or possibly mentally ill. And what's really interesting is that it does give us a good description of what is probably being meant when they refer to the tying up of somebody who is described as mentally unsound. So I'm going to read the introduction to this character. Ingald had a son called Helgi, and he was an idiot, the biggest you ever saw, and utterly witless. He was treated so that a pierstone was tied round his neck, and he grazed out of doors like a sheep, and he was called Ingald's idiot. He was tall of growth, almost like a giant. So again, the first thing I kind of want to recognize is that, again, even in this more modern translation, which is modern in a historical sense, it's from the 1860s. And this translation is maintaining, and I think properly, maintaining, the fact that the language being used to describe this individual is inherently discriminatory and negative. He's being translated as idiot in this case. But I think it's also worth noting again that this character who's named Helgi mentions he was called Ingald's idiot, and indeed for the rest of the text, the name Helgi is never mentioned outside of that introduction. Every other time he is referred to as Ingald's idiot or the idiot. There is no other time other than that introduction where he is actually referred to by his name Helgi. He is always referred to in this derogatory manner after this. But again, going back to what it means when it refers to the tying up of these individuals is, again, they have a big stone with a hole in it, and he is tied to by the neck and left outdoors, foraging for food, which in this case is eating the grass around him, rather than being, fed properly, housed indoors, and all of these things, which is something that is not only, necessarily and inherently abusive mistreatment, but it is, again, even compared to in the text, the way that you would treat an animal. And again, this is a way that we have stopped treating animals because we recognize it as being sort of inherently abusive. If you took your own pet or your own livestock today and you didn't give them shelter and you didn't give them proper food and just left them, chained or tied at the neck to a post or something, that is something that, animal rights advocacies and stuff would argue against, that's being inherently abusive to the animal. And that's the way that neurodivergent or mentally disabled people are being treated very much in the early medieval era. And there's actually a 1981 film adaptation which does portray this individual and portray that description in a short clip that I will show now. So again, I think that's a very powerful clip to understand that is actually the lived experiences of a lot of these people. And while that is powerful and something that I think is worth remembering and worth coming back to, the other thing I want to mention is later on in the text, there's this description where a group of men go to Ingald's farm and see Helgi. "We think it fine fun," they said, "to look at the idiot and all of his mad pranks." The men said she being, in this case, Ingald, the caretaker of Helgi. They said she was in a sad plight when she had to tend such a fool as that. Which again goes back to, if we imagine the Irish legal texts, the fact that one, again, it's switching to a translation of fool, which again is something we might imagine like a clown or a court jester. There is no discrimination between the concepts of somebody who is neurodivergent or intellectually disabled and somebody pretending to be for entertainment, both in terms of, again, that language in this translation, but also the way that it's being regarded. They think it's funny to watch him just exist in the way that he does. Which again is something we should view as incredibly negative right across the board, but also they're viewing it as something that is not just funny to them around them, but is a negative experience towards his caretakers. It's a sad plight that the neurotypical people around him have to care for him. But both of those are, I think, really important to, again, understanding the lived experiences of high support needs neurodivergent individuals in the early Middle Ages. So, circling back to how this started with those posts, I don't want to say that we should rob people of having this nice escapist fantasy. Escapist fantasies are fun and are a good way to sort of cope with the struggles of life. But at the same time, I do think it is incredibly important that we recognize that those escapist fantasies are in fact escapist fantasies, and that the lived experiences of neurodivergent peoples in pre-modern societies, and particularly those neurodivergent people with higher support needs that are often absent from these discussions is incredibly and inherently negative in ways that we would find absolutely abusive today. And as we're talking about sort of the history of neurodivergence, and even looking for forwards, to how we want neurodivergent people to be treated and advocated for moving forward, that it's really important that we recognize that fact. That the lived experiences of most neurodivergent people in the past isn't what's being described in those posts, but is being shown towards Helgi here.
It is. Mikkel sagt har fipplen och ingalls.